Good morning. Let me see. Let me just see if this microphone works. Does this microphone work? Okay, it doesn't work. Okay, that's good. Good. And I'll hang on to this. Well, good morning. I wanted to first thank Ed and Pat for coming. I kind of said to them a couple of weeks ago when Kelly invited me to speak, please, I would really like Ed and Pat to come to this, because the three of us, as some of you know, perhaps, we wrote a book together, Conversations with Ed, and I'm showing it because it shows that beautiful picture of Ed on the cover. And that was really our attempt to speak about what we call forgetfulness in a very different way, because we are actually living in some amazingly interesting times where we have a revolution and we are not quite sure that a revolution is actually happening. And the revolution is one of how we look at life and how we look at ourselves. And what I mean by that is that the last 200-300 years of the scientific paradigm, you know, the idea that there is something outside, was kind of the main way how we looked at life. Meaning there is really a chair, there is really a human being on the other side, and that person is independent of who we are. That was the old way of thinking. And now, just a few months ago, we started to radically shift it. You probably read about it in the Chronicle. And the radical shift is that actually we are all connected. That actually you are not separate from me. And now comes the most amazing thing to think about. You, when I look at you, you actually are inside of me. How is that possible? Well, I see you in me, right? Right? I mean, my eyes take you in, so then in me is the image of you. Right? Think about that for a moment. Isn't that fascinating? It was in the Chronicle on the second page, actually. It talked about that. I'm kidding. But I mean, that idea, right? That idea that you show up in me because I see you in my eyes, is that right? Right? I see you in my eyes, so you must be in me. Otherwise, how could I see you? Isn't that fascinating? If you really think about that, right? Don't you just want to go home and just think about that all day? Right? I mean, I just find that amazing. You are in me. Now how I want to just move very fast forward to how that actually has something to do with how we look at dementia, because in a nice, provocative way, but actually not in a very provocative way, I wanted to call it the cure for dementia. Because the cure for dementia is how we look at dementia. And that's why I actually don't even want to call it anymore dementia, but we want to call it forgetfulness, because we don't want to label it, right? The moment you start labeling something, what happens? Everything that you have labeled then is seen through the lens of the label, right? Some of you have children, or many of you have children, so once you have identified a messy child, that child is going to have a hard time ever to not be messy. But Mom, I put it all away. Yes, but you forgot all about that. Oh, Mom, you didn't tell me that last time. Right? It's hard to undo a label once you have a label, right? He's always this way, and then it's very hard to undo it. So the same thing with the label. The moment you have put a label on someone like dementia, it's very hard to let go of it. Then when you drop a pencil, or when you look a little bit lost, or you're dreaming a little bit, people will say, oh yeah, that's him because he's demented. Ed came to us. Can I talk about a few things about Ed?
Why not? You know more than anybody but me.
Oh, there we go. So Ed came to us some 5 years ago, and he got a letter in the mail that said, you have been diagnosed with dementia. And Ed, being from Texas, says, hell no. I ain't demented. And basically calls me up and says, hey, I've heard that you are doing something that actually looks at forgetfulness in a different way, and I'd like to meet you and I'd like to talk to you because, I just don't buy this medical stuff. So that actually then led us to connect in San Francisco. He flew up from Orange County. And then I had, I don't know, I think Pat, you and I had just met in some workshop, right, about forgetfulness that we were giving. And so then I thought, oh, we should have Pat, who has researched Alzheimer's and the reason why we have that disease concept of Alzheimer's and what purpose it serves, and he can talk more about that in a bit. And so I thought we should all just sit together and have conversations. That was the beginning of the book, Conversations with Ed, because we wanted to really look at what is forgetfulness, what is that actually? Because if you are in me, then of course the way that I look at you makes all the difference in the way that you appear inside of me, right? For example, I was thinking about some examples. We say love is blind, right? So there's something in quantum physics that unless you can somehow make sense of it in very normal language that we always use, it shouldn't be true. And so, for example, love is blind is a great idea in the sense that you are with someone and you don't really see the quote-unquote faults, right? Why is that? Because you love that person, right? A child, when a child comes to you and is all excited, 2 years old, and speaks in some kind of nice, wonderful, dreamy language, you don't go and say to the child, hey, listen, Buster, you learn some English first, and then when you're done with that, you come back. Right? I mean, there are some people, they are still in therapy, right? But, you don't do that. You just love that kid, right? I mean, it's because there's something deep in that person that matters. It's not the language thing. It's just like you're not even expecting that. And even if a child turns out to not speak that well, or is different in some ways, or has a different ability, what some people call a disability, and we can call it a different functionality or something, you still love the child. You don't see that. If a child doesn't have a leg and it's your child, you don't identify the child with not having a leg. You love your child. It's very, very straightforward, right? And the same thing with forgetfulness. So I just want to throw out some radical ideas because you're all very caring and loving people, and I want to thank actually all of us for that, because we have picked a profession, we have picked a job where we deeply care for others. And that's not thanked enough for, right? I mean, we need to really appreciate ourselves more, that we get up in the morning and what do? We want to care for other people. That's beautiful. Who does that? Here. We come here, and then we come here and sit through traffic, and then we have to listen, and we want to, coffee comes late, all the stuff you have to, all the stuff that you have to put up with, It's amazing, So what I want to say is in some ways that, there's so many things to say, but the idea really that I want to leave you with is forgetfulness is another state of mind. That's really how I would like you to look at it, not as a disease. And I would like you to also entertain the idea that we live in a meaningful universe. What does that mean? That things that happen have meaning. Do some of you believe that? 3 people nodding? No. 5. So if things have meaning, the latest research shows some 85% of the people believe in God or some higher spirit. So if things have meaning, wouldn't forgetfulness have meaning? I mean, we can't say this has meaning, but that doesn't. I mean, either we live in a meaningful universe where things have meaning, and then everything has to have meaning. Or we believe in a random universe. The random universe means what? I think it's summarized on a bumper sticker. Shit happens. Right? That's a random universe. But a random universe, guys, is not an easy universe to live in. Why not? You have no control. right? Something happens to you and you make it about yourself. I should have been smarter, I should have been more intelligent, I should have been more aware, I should have been anything, because you believe that what happened because you just weren't aware enough. That's a tough universe to live in. And hopeless, that's right. It's a hopeless universe because you're just kind of thrown in here willy-nilly and you labor through life and that's it, and then, you know. So we live in a meaningful universe. That means forgetfulness has meaning. You know, why we forget things, there is something behind it. Naomi Klein, as some of you know, she goes around the country and she actually says that, you know, there is something still that wants to be worked on. We just had recently, actually tomorrow we're going to have a little celebration in San Francisco for Wesley Zinetsky, who was an Auschwitz survivor. And he died exactly a year ago, tomorrow. And he was a yogi, very well-known yogi. And he, in the last 5 years, as he became increasingly forgetful, would say to all of us, you know, nature is doing what I haven't been able to do myself, which is to forget myself. And isn't that really the ultimate expression of love? Where you are not thinking about yourself, but you're thinking completely about the other? Isn't that what love is? Isn't that the definition of love? You forget yourself, and you're just there for the others. And that's what care is. The meaning of life in some traditions is basically you care. Selfless service. Selfless service. You're not caught in your own self, in your own mind, but you're there for the other. And if you know, and as all of you know, so many of the care partners who work with elders on an everyday basis, they are angels. I'm going to give it over to Ed.
I've got to leave right now.
You hold that up. You want to get up, or you have two microphones?
I'd like to take a nap and then get together.
Yeah, you don't need that.
Were you here all this time this morning? Some of you look familiar. Hi, I'm Ed Voris. I'm from Dallas, Texas, but I'm sorry. And I won't make that mistake again. Where shall we start? For one thing, one of the most difficult things that I've ever faced in my life was freeing myself from ignoring the reality that I got it. And I'm really just starting to, I have about 15 years of progression in whatever it is that I have. And I'm trying to learn to live with that reality. And I find that it's really hard to admit I got it. I'd be happy to let you know that you got it. I can even do it over the phone. but it's a nice thing because I can need to do it and know that I have to do it, but this isn't a good day for it. You know, I don't know what a good day for it is, but it doesn't include me and reality. And so I'm trying to learn to be honest with myself and say, let's get started. And then I'm going to have to find where you are. And you know, what you're doing about what you have. And then to our amazement, I bet you we'll find out that we're from the same place. And it's not very much fun to talk about. But I've got to learn to talk, and I've got to start rebuilding Ed again from wherever it is that we come from. I can't tell you how much these have been friends of mine for, what, 5 years or something like that. And I've been there and not introduced myself to Nader and said, you know, I got it and want your help. You know, it's such a tough thing to have to get help. But if they buy my lunch or something, it gets more attractive. You know, to get this in order to get lunch is, you know, there's something wrong with that system. Well, I won't go into detail because I don't have any detail to go into. But I'm hoping someday I'll need it, and I'll start suiting up with my friends here and make a trip toward the real Ed. And I'm not nearly as attractive to myself as I thought I was. But I hope that a system can be built to free people up so they can begin to work on rebuilding their own lives and becoming what life really has for us. So with that, I don't want to answer any questions.
Well, Nader gave me the tough act to follow. So what I wanted to talk about, though, was a little bit to build upon what Nader was talking about. There's this concept in sociology, which is where I come from, and there was a sociologist by the name of Thorstein Veblen who lived in the 20s, 30s. And he came up with this concept called trained incapacity. And what he was pointing out that as we, from birth until death, we grow up in a world that is already there, and we integrate and are integrated into it. And the way we're integrated in initially is we learn to speak language, as Nader was talking about, the 2-year-old who says things, and it might not be the, quote, appropriate thing to say, but because they're our child, we love them and we find it cute and endearing. But over time, the child has to grow up. And in order to grow up, you have to learn how to speak properly. You have to learn the social norms that guide our behavior unconsciously, for the most part, in everyday life. Now, what Veblen was talking about when he was talking about trained incapacity is the idea that precisely because of the way we learn to see the world, we cannot see the world in other ways. Okay, we see it based on a whole host of complicated experiences. And what Nader was talking about in relationship to Alzheimer's disease, we have as a society been socialized to believe in forgetfulness as a disease. And there's a huge infrastructure and industry around wanting to promote that. And it, in some ways, gives people hope. Maybe we'll find a cure. Maybe we'll find a good treatment that will stem the course of the disease. But you know, they've been working on that for over 30 years, and the treatments today are not that dissimilar to the treatments of 15 years ago. So then the question becomes, that's fine, but the problem is that that frame of reference has permeated our society and has led us to a trained incapacity kind of problem, I think, in our society. And that is, once we see someone who has been labeled, as Nader was saying, with dementia or Alzheimer's, that label becomes the master over that person, where everything that happens to that person becomes interpreted in that context of that label. And it's like, as you grow older, like we all are, you know, you forget where your car keys are. Instead of saying, oh yeah, well, you know, that's just what happens, you say, oh, I wonder if I have early Alzheimer's disease. But what that kind of frame does, it creates an incapacity to see other things in, as Nader was talking about, the experience of the other who may be forgetful. And it prevents us in some ways from wholly seeing the other and accepting the other as they are, not as opposed to how we think they should be. And that can have, if you make that shift out of the trained incapacity into seeing the other in a way that is more open, then you turn a lot of corners, as Nader was saying. You then come to realize, well, maybe there is something I can learn from this other person. Maybe there is something that they can teach me that I will not be able to learn or see if I see them as diseased, if I see them as pathological. Because that pathology frame can then become the way that that can lead perniciously to the dehumanization of the other person. Because we see them as, their behavior is problematic just because their brain chemistry is screwed up. But if we start to see them in another way, then we can say, wait a minute, let's encounter the person as they are, and lo and behold, you can find out that you can learn a lot of things, not only about the other, but about yourself. Where the person who we see as diseased can actually become our teacher. We can learn from them. I'll give you an example. One of the things that we, in our society, strive for, and in many societies, you strive to live in the moment. There are books written about how to train yourself to live in the moment. Well, here we have people that are by necessity living in the moment, and we're not even thinking about maybe we ought to encounter them in the moment to see how they live in the moment, and maybe we can learn to live better in the moment, as opposed to worrying about what we're going to do, you know, when we get home. What do I have in the refrigerator to eat for dinner? Or, you know, when do the kids come? You know, it's amazing when you start to live in the now, a lot of that stuff kind of goes away. It's not that it goes away forever, but in the immediate conscious experience, it's not of concern. And that can be very liberating. So we have people who actually have to be that way, and we don't want to be around them. What's that about? So this is the idea, it's just to say, if we encounter the person without these preconceptions, try to bracket them, keep them away. They're going to be there all the time because the society is structured to where that's the dominant frame. That's the dominant paradigm that we understand people who are forgetful. It's a disease frame, it's a pathology frame, and what does that tell us on some level? It tells us that that is the way to control other people. Because when we set them aside and say they are different than us, then that can lead to all kinds of problems. As opposed to what Nader was talking about, you conceive of the other in your mind and they conceive of you in their mind. That's what a sociologist called George Herbert Mead, in spite of Nader saying it was in the Chronicle 2 weeks ago, probably about the 30s, he came up with the concept of the looking glass self. Where the only way, because we are separate from one another in physical space, that we know the other is through seeing the other in terms of the frames that we have. And the problem is, whenever we see the other, we never see the whole of the other. We only see juxtaposed fragments here and there, and yet that's all we have to make meaning out of the other. So if our juxtaposed fragments are interpreted in the framework of a pathology and a disease, then that gives us a certain orientation to the other, which can be problematic from the standpoint of what Nader was talking about. So, what I would suggest is that if we try to have an openness to people who are different than us, people who can't remember as well as we can, and being able to encounter that in its fullness, you know, we may learn some things. And I'm not saying that the biomedical framework is not a useful one. It can be useful for a whole host of reasons. One example is it can make sense out of something that is nonsensical to people. Why can't I remember my address? What is happening? The problem, I think, in our society is that it has become so overpowering that it has quashed out other ways of seeing people once they get that label. A student of mine did some research where she basically sat in support groups for people who were in the early stages of Alzheimer's and watched and listened and recorded what they said about what was it about getting the diagnosis. How did it change my life? And I remember this beautiful quote because we wrote a paper together on her work, and it was one of the women that was in the group. And she says, I'm paraphrasing, she said, you know, when I would get mad, I used to go out and just walk around the block a couple of times and kind of let off some steam through, you know, walking quickly. But when I told people I had Alzheimer's, then they come up to me and they say, oh, how are you doing? I'll walk around with you. And she said, it took away my freedom. I don't want them walking around with me. I want to do it myself to burn off the steam. But she couldn't because people were concerned about her. And so it's the loss of freedom that she was experiencing as a big problem. And, you know, you folks are dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. How do you judge what, you know, you have to do from the standpoint of your professional training and background versus, you know, allowing the person as much freedom and independence as possible? So I'm saying merely that if we look at things from different perspectives, we can many times have epiphanies. We can see the world, we can break out of that trained incapacity that we have and see things in ways that we never even thought existed. And it's amazing how many things exist that we never see, but they're there. The seen but unnoticed aspects of everyday life are the most profound. Nader was talking about that in terms of the quantum physics idea. If you can't explain a concept to somebody in everyday language, it probably doesn't exist. Because we live in a world where so much of it we take for granted. And we take for granted based on the way we were socialized to believe the world to be. And that's comforting on one hand because it provides a continuity, it provides a stability to our world. But it can also be our master. And we can be its slave if we let it dominate us to the point where we're not open even to seeing another kind of reality in the reality that we accept and take for granted. Because that reality is the one that is the structure of how we exist in our society. And that's a social fact, as the famous sociologist Emile Durkheim said, that there are things that we don't see, but they affect us so profoundly because they're patterns of being and behaving that, taken in their totality, a sociologist might say that's the social structure, that's the structure of our society. But that can also be a way of controlling others in institutional ways that are adjudicated by laws and regulations and rules, which you all have to deal with in your everyday practice. And it sometimes is suffocating. But I just urge you to look for the times and the little places where those kind of different frames of understanding the other can take hold and take root and help us not lose sight of the humanity of the other, irrespective of how we may see them as not being able to function in the normative ways that we would expect normal, quote-unquote, functioning people. Because there's a lot that you can learn, as you all already know, about people who are different. And these kinds of ways of being in the world, which give us more of an openness to those differences, I think can make us richer as humans and can make our experience and work with others more satisfying and more profound. Because the things that we take for granted the most and we don't think about are the most profound things that affect us. So anyway.
Thank you, Pat. So I wanted to just see, one of the things that Pat reminded me of was actually the idea, we live in a mainstream society, of course, where, as Pat said, we have a disease conceptualization. You are different, so therefore you must be diseased, right? I mean, especially those who know about psychology, it's a very popular thing to do. You're a little bit different, so therefore it's got to be a pathology, right? So anybody who has ever read through the diagnostic book of psychological disorders, I mean, by the time you're at the second or third page, you think, oh, shucks, this is all me. And right? And by the time you're done with the book, you don't actually want to leave the house anymore because, you know, and then it's pretty bad. So, and by the way, when you were talking about normality, Pat, I was always thinking about what is so exciting about being normal, right? I mean, imagine, you know, like, you know, somebody saying to you, your kid is growing up, I hope it's going to be a really normal kid, right? I mean, you don't want to be normal, right? I mean, so, but why is this attachment to normality so out there? But one thing, since we do live in a world of biomedicine, I wanted to at least put down that from, and that's, as Pat mentioned, it's also a good thing. They're looking for cures, and who knows, that might happen. I want to say that since most of us here are in a care field, that from a caring point of view, it is not helpful, I propose, to be using a biomedical language. So when we, for example, as care partners or as social workers or discharge planners or community relations people or people who are working with elders in whatever way, when we talk about the other, let's use a language that actually fits our caring, our deep humanity. Because we are, as we said, caring people, and we don't want to pathologize. Let the kind of disease model of dementia that uses the term dementia, and I know many of you have listened to me about this before, but dementia means literally what? What are the root meanings in this word? Mental, right? Mm-hmm. Losing your mind away from the mind, right? And as I like to say, and Pat studied philosophy and I studied philosophy, we have yet, after some 10,000 years of recorded human history, to define what the mind is. Which doesn't mean that some of you wouldn't know that. So maybe if there's a person who wants to quickly give a definition of a mind, you can tell me later. But I mean, the idea is a mind is so complex. We don't know what is a mind. Is it us thinking? Is it us being aware? Is it feeling, etc., etc., etc.? We don't know what a mind is, but yet we have no problem calling something no mind. Right? Isn't that fascinating? You know, how can we define something as no mind if we don't even know what mind is? This is a little bit like mental health, right? And mental illness. Well, if you have mental illness, you must have mental health. Who is mentally healthy here? Who would out themselves as mentally healthy? You know, yeah, because it's kind of ridiculous. Actually, I don't want to be mentally healthy, right? Well, I mean, actually, I don't. You know, so this all may be working very well for scientists, and so when they want to use all the language of plaques and synapses and who knows. That's all good. Let them use it because they need it for dissection and analysis and so forth. But here we are. We are in a caring field and we say somebody's forgetful, and I know there are many more symptoms to that, etc., etc. But we're saying that person is in a different reality or has a different state of mind, right? And we can learn from that, as Pat says. I never forget it. It's a really nice story. And Christina, you know those people. That my neighbor next door developed forgetfulness and was already 95. How can you be forgetful at 95? I don't know. And so they came to H-Song in San Francisco, and his two daughters were devastated. They were both nurses. And they called me up and were crying, and our dad has always been the strong person in the family, is always the one who was our teacher, and now here he is, you know, and we have to take care of him, and that's so hard, and I can't believe that, etc., etc. And then I talked to them, and I said, you know, your dad is still your teacher. And then there was a silence. And then, how is that? Well, now he is teaching you to not to be so attached to what you say, not to be so fast, to go more slow, to be more loving, to be more kind, to be more attentive, to be more in the moment, to be more here. There's an incredible host of things that now your dad is teaching you. It's not in the normal way of how we think teaching should happen, but it's a different teaching. And then also when we talk to our students, these are psychology students, social work students that work with forgetfulness. I will sometimes ask them 3 or 4 or 5 months into their internship when they work with elders, so what have you learned? And one of my favorites is, that just happened recently, is when one student said, I learned to be more loving to myself, or I learned to be more forgiving when I forget, when I'm not fully on it, when I lose things. I'm much less critical. I'm much less critical. Now, isn't that a beautiful learning? Wouldn't we all like to learn more of that? I certainly would. Not to be so tough with myself, right? Or to be able to go more slow, or to actually be here and enjoy the moment. It's so fascinating, as Pat says. We go to a workshop in learning how to be in the moment. And here we, every moment, have a moment to learn to be in the moment. That was pretty good. Somebody recorded that, I hope. I got to reread that later. Anyway, I think that's, I actually was told recently by the Generation Y, you know, the Generation Y. I was asked to give them a little talk, and I said, oh, well, these are all the things that I can talk about. And then he wrote back, that's very nice, but we keep our talks to 8 minutes. And I said, wow. Yeah, he says, if you can't say it in 8 minutes, then it's not worthy to talk about. So sorry, I think we're over 8 minutes by now. So we maybe can open it up to questions or answers or hypotheses or yes, here.
What really got me is my name is Sharon Fitzgerald. I'm Meals on Wheels in Contra Costa County. Is that I also myself have had to care for someone with the label of Alzheimer's. And I was commenting to a couple of my friends today here that how I personally struggled, even though I'm in the field, and that I'll never go to heaven. I'm going to make it to purgatory, but not to heaven because of all the thoughts I had and difficulty. But what really struck me is, first of all, thank you so much for this, because I feel sort of free and I hope that they can retrain. But most of all, what struck me is I think a lot of times when people are labeled dementia, even if they don't say Alzheimer's, their mind is saying it, even if they're not saying it, is removing with your talk the feeling of exhaustion. I think when you have to start caring for someone in your own life, and I can't speak for the professionals in the field because that's not the actual area I do, there's this weight that comes that you feel exhausted. And I see from what you're proposing a new way of looking at it, and yes, taking better care of yourself, which we all talk about, and sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. That's probably why I have a picture on my door of a chair by a beach, and I call it my getaway when I need that. But I think that's pretty tremendous. You know, the idea of thinking about of being with somebody and not saying this is heavy and weighted and exhausting. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
I listened to you speak with Ed, I think about 2 years ago at least, and something that really struck me that I use with the families of these potential residents at St. Regis where I work is Ed, I think, is the one that had said something about how he was enjoying his life like he had never before. And I think that's what families tend to forget. They want to feel sorry for them. And I'm so sorry that you're living with this disease. And can you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Ed, you got quoted.
I've got to go. What am I supposed to answer?
Well, she was mentioning that you actually were mentioning a few years ago that you were having a really good time with your life.
Yeah.
Yeah? How are we doing today?
Not as good.
Oh.
I have been in a period of, see, I first began to suspect something in me about 15 years ago, and it's been progressively moving in slow progression to whatever it is, if it ever gets there. I feel that I have avoided the reality for 15 years, and I have to face it. Or I don't have to face it if I want to just sit there and wait till it falls apart. And I have the good fortune of friends like this. So if I don't make it, then boy, am I a fool. You know, I'm really excited. We worked together, 3 or 4 years ago, I think. And I need to quit talking about what I have, and I'll deal with it when I get to it. And get to it, and then take the next step, whatever it is. I feel incredibly fortunate to have this as an opportunity. Most don't. And I pray that somehow the product of this work will bring about other forms of support and correction and whatever else it fits. But the thing that I think is bigger, more important than anything else I'm aware of is making a commitment to do something. And I've been a specialist in not doing something. And if you need lessons in that, I'll pass this one back.
I think, let me just, also what I wanted to say, what came up for me is that what really we would love to advocate is, and that's actually also part of quantum physics and field ideas, and is supported by much of very modern science that hasn't made it to the normal science, which is the idea that how I look at you makes all the difference. And you actually feel that. And this is not a novel concept. People know that if they're being loved, or somebody is non-judgmental and accepting of them. You feel that. You know you want to be in the company of certain people, and you don't want to be in the company of other people, right? There's a certain feeling. So really what we want to advocate at the max, and I think this is what Ed is talking about when he says he's thankful for having people around him that don't look at him as diseased, that we cannot look at people with eyes of disease, but as we like to say, with eyes of love, and acceptance, and that the other person will feel it, whether he or she is normal or not normal or whatever that all means. And especially if somebody is forgetful, that we don't feel that this other person is less than, but rather is a teacher, is somebody who is valuable to us, for us, in terms of learning more, becoming more aware, deepening who we are. And that other person, whether it's Ed or whoever, is sensing that. And that will make all the difference. And that's the world, when Ed talks about this, that's the world we would like to create, where we are in the field. So when we become forgetful, that we are going to be around people that just look at us as, wow, you are amazing. You know, how do you do that? And then Ed will say, he doesn't know, but that's great. Then you have to figure it out yourself. That's what all the traditions say. Yeah.
When we're talking about normalcy, and we're talking about acceptance, and we're talking about perception. I have a son with Asperger's, and what I always said about that is the cure for Asperger's isn't a shot, and it's not a medication, and it's not therapy, it's understanding.
Oh, beautiful.
Because if people simply understand my child's brain is wired a little differently and he comes at it differently, he has so much to offer from that. So if you just understand that, that is the cure. And there's nothing necessary other than that. So I think that also applies. I never put it together with aging. I'm a reverse mortgage specialist, and I work exclusively with seniors. So that perception that I had about my son, whom I love, is I never kind of did that switch to the same thing with forgetfulness and some of the issues the seniors face. So I really appreciate that epiphany that you presented to me today.
Oh, wonderful.
And the second comment was your perception again on our own forgetfulness. I have friends that freak out if they put their keys in the refrigerator, right? And they call me and go, do you think I'm getting dementia or Alzheimer's? And I always say, well, you know, you got to find the humor in life. So when I put the keys in the refrigerator, I just laugh and laugh, and I go, Linda, you are so silly, because the stress can produce the negative disease that we speak of. And if you just realize it's a natural part of aging and find the humor in it, I think that we can all look at it from a different perspective.
Beautiful, beautiful. Actually, we should do like a little support group around what we all have done. You know, I think keys in the fridge is very mild compared to some of the other things I can think about. Yes, yeah, please.
Could you please have some practical advice if the person having any kind of condition is actually encountering a family member that is not open to looking at things the way that you are suggesting? So, and this applies also in life when, for instance, you live with somebody that's very critical. You would like them to look at you differently, not through those critical eyes, but they are not open to looking at it differently. So if you have Alzheimer's or dementia and the other person chooses that alternative, you'd like them to look at yourself as a whole person, as a potential exchange of learning and teaching, but if they're not, what would you recommend?
Medication? Therapy, yes, therapy. Well, that's of course a very beautiful, deep question. I mean, in some ways, it's culture change. This would normally be the moment I hand it over to Pat. I mean, I think there are many answers to, or many suggestions. There's never any answers. Answers are always just personal. So, but a suggestion would be, let's stay with the person who's critical, because it seems like that's difficult. So how do we work with that? How, well, one is, what are they critical about? Can I talk with them? Can I have awareness around it? I mean, it's an educational process on the one hand. It's also a spiritual process. You know, meaning, what are we here to learn? I mean, if I'm in partnership with someone, what is it that let me invite the critical person into my life for? Right? I mean, that's another question. If we live in a meaningful universe, then we say, interesting, I picked someone that is so critical about me, and what is that all about? Right? Say again? Or in your office, yes. It sounds like we may have to switch jobs then. But I mean, awareness is our most powerful tool. That's the only thing that we have any choice over. I can choose something. That's the only thing that I can do. And to bring it up, and also not make it about yourself, that if a person is critical about yourself, it's all, you're just in a role, you're being picked on, so to speak, right? It's always something, what's not being spoken, what's the elephant in the room? I mean, we would almost have to role play it, what's actually happening, in order to maybe come up with something more practical for you, you know? Are you asking me for some practical suggestion? Would that be helpful? Yeah? For example? Yeah, I mean, to sit down, I mean, especially with family members, let me talk about what I actually know about. So when I sit with family members who say, my dad has Alzheimer's and can you take care of him? Then, and I notice that there's a lot of angst or a lot of anxiety in the other. And they feel really, my God, this is terrible that this happened to my dad. And life is at the end, and how could there be any quality of life? Then it is an educational process, just like we are talking here. And you say very strongly as the social worker or the person who is in the assisted living community or wherever you are, say, no, I actually don't believe that that's the case. We actually don't think that this is a disease state, but that this is something that your dad has to go through, and you are actually the one that needs to learn here at the moment. I'm sorry to say that like that, but it is the case. And if you want some literature, there's a lot of literature out there these days by people who have forgetfulness, who speak. Richard Taylor is one, right? And I think you've had somebody on your board, I think, right? Who was that? That was, you're on the Alzheimer's board of California. Yeah.
What Nader's talking, can you hear me? Okay, what Nader's talking about is the state of California has an Alzheimer's disease and related disorders advisory committee, okay, that has been in existence since 1985. It's not until 2 years ago that someone was on that board with Alzheimer's disease. So there's an institutional example of how you get the label and you are banished somewhere, to where you don't even have a voice in issues and policies that affect your class of people, i.e. people with forgetfulness, dementia, Alzheimer's. So that was an interesting revelation.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm aware this is it's a very complex situation there, but I mean that's really all I could say is that we are in the process of educating people, and that we're also saying, hey, that's hurtful when you talk to me this way. You know, if somebody's critical, I mean that's where we help each other to become aware of the patterns that we are in. You know, so that's what I would say. Yeah.
Isn't there a fine line between putting a label and treating somebody this way and also denial?
Well, denial, that's at least a 5-day workshop.
The correct way?
Yeah, the correct way. I mean, we have, actually in some ways, I'm sometimes invited to be within a kind of support group of people who have lost someone because of forgetfulness. And so they talk about, you know, that journey. And I actually have to say that in the last years, I've become aware that the treatment that we have for forgetfulness, the various 2, 3, or 4 or 5 medications that are out there, seem to be causing a lot of side effects that are very intense, from nightmares to gait issues and confusion, et cetera, et cetera. So meaning we are not at a point, for example, with HIV, where we have a clear kind of a treatment that's actually helping. Yes?
I was just thinking about it from a treatment perspective, but from a safety perspective.
Right. Oh, I see. So somebody being, you know, wandering out and so forth. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Where, you know, how can we do that in a loving way? Basically, that's really what it's an attitude thing. So versus, oh my God, like, you know, you can't go, like Pat's example, you can't go anywhere because people feel you're going to run in front of the car. To kind of a more, what can you do? You know, getting away from, as we call it, a custodial care model where I know what to do for you, to a partnership, you know, and actually really noticing what is still possible or what is safe and secure. I mean, that's a big issue, right? But to do it on an individual basis rather than, aha, this person cannot do this anymore, so therefore everything else around must be bad too. I think Ed was talking about a story when he was told that he has so-called forgetfulness or dementia, that he wanted to go to the Alzheimer's support meeting in Orange County. And when he told them that he had dementia, or that he was labeled demented, they basically said, you can't come here because you need somebody who's your guardian, right? So he was sent away because he was not able any longer, according to them, to make any independent decision. But here is, I don't know if he drove. Did you drive there? Did you drive to, you remember that Alzheimer's Association?
No, I got rid of my car.
Oh, you got rid of the car. That's right. Yeah, that's also an issue, right? Yeah. Mimi.
It reminds me the statement of Dr. Wayne Dyer that says, if you change the way you look at things, the things that you are looking at will change.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I'm Mimi Salamad. I'm a clinical audiologist, and I deal with the hard of hearing people on a daily basis. And after they are fitted with their hearing aids, they are still complaining that their family members still don't talk with them. They are being deprived of basic communication, which makes us human. And also, we know that one of the side effects of hearing loss is having depression and anxiety, and also affecting short-term and long-term memory. And I encourage my patient to come with the family member, and most of my work is counseling with them to continue your normal conversation, daily activity with your loved one. Don't look at them differently. Change the way you are behaving toward them. Beautiful. And you, basically, all of you, reflected this aspect, and I wanted to thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you. I think that's probably, is this a good time to stop? I mean, it's a big topic, and, we, maybe we'll do another trio one day, huh? Take it on the road, do the road show. Thank you so much for listening, for coming.